Training camp is beginning for the New York Jets, and the biggest position battles are not player versus player. They feature players competing against themselves. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Wednesday, July 23rd, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today our episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. On today's show, we have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's begin with our first question. It's about training camp position battles. Dear John, which position battles are you watching most closely this year in training camp? And of course, the Jets set to kick things off at training camp this week. The veterans have arrived. Yesterday was the day where the veterans reported to training camp. So we are about to start practice for the 2025 season. Now, I think the position battle that will draw the most attention is the one at the center position for the New York Jets. That is Joe Tippmann versus Josh Myers. Tippmann is the incumbent starter. Myers was a free agent signing from the Green Bay Packers. But I think in many ways, that might be the least consequential of the position battles. And I say that from the standpoint that the Jets have two fairly accomplished players competing in that battle. They know that at the center position, they're probably going to get pretty solid play. Now, my money would be on Tippmann winning the job. I think Tippmann has been the better player through his career, but it certainly seems, based on what we're hearing from the Jets coaching staff and what we're hearing from the media, that Tippmann is not going to get the incumbency advantage that most players get. Most of the time, once you are the entrenched starter at a position, as Tippmann has been at center for the New York Jets, it takes something extreme for you to lose the job. Like somebody has to really outperform you, or you have to really play poorly. It sounds like that's going to be a real position battle. But the thing is, the loser of that battle might be the best interior backup offensive lineman in the NFL. You know, that's a battle where you have two guys who have both established themselves as decent starters. I think Myers is a decent starter. I think Tippmann's a good starter. So I expect Tippmann to win that battle. So that's the one that will generate the most attention. But I'm looking elsewhere. And I think in many ways, these position battles are not player versus player. They're more individual battles. And I would say that's true at positions like wide receiver, defensive tackle, and even to a lesser extent, the safety position. And why do I say that? Well, at each of these positions, you have a veteran presence, but you know what the veteran's going to give you is just not that special. Like at wide receiver, if Josh Reynolds ends up being the number 2 wide receiver for the Jets, you know you're not getting great play. You know, Josh Reynolds is a guy who's had a long NFL career. You got to have a lot of respect for a guy who makes a career for himself the way Josh Reynolds has, and he's posted a couple 600-yard seasons. But I think you know you're not getting more than 600 yards from Josh Reynolds. And that's at best. At best, you're getting 600 yards from Josh Reynolds. At best, he's going to be a very, very low-end number 2 receiver. At best, he's going to be like a borderline number 2 receiver. That's it, again, if everything goes right. So the guy I'm looking at is Arian Smith. You know, I'll be honest with you. If you've listened to the show the last couple of months, you know that I was not a huge fan of that pick when the Jets selected him in the 4th round of the NFL draft. But I look at this roster right now, and he's like the one guy who I think has a legitimate chance of developing into a quality number 2 receiver in the NFL. And that's mainly because of his speed. The question is, can the Jets coach him up? This was a project pick. This was a pick that says, we believe that this guy's got the attributes to succeed, and we believe that we can coach him into being a quality player. In many cases, this is easier said than done in the NFL. But, you look at across the rest of the team. I mean, is Allen Lazard going to be a good number 2 receiver? I think we know the answer to that is definitively no. A couple other young guys. I mean, is it theoretically possible that Malachi Corley could develop into a quality wide receiver? Look, I would not cut Corley before training camp, but I think everybody should acknowledge it's going to be kind of a long road for Malachi Corley. Is Xavier Gipson going to develop into a quality number 2 receiver? I mean, he hasn't really improved since the first day he set foot on the field for the Jets 2 years ago. I guess maybe new coaching could help fix that, but I don't see Xavier Gipson ever being a player who's going to contribute in the NFL. So in many ways, this is like, how good can Arian Smith get? Because if Arian Smith can develop into a quality player quickly, there's not any competition for the job. I mean, he's going to get the number 2 receiver job. But if not, it's going to fall to Josh Reynolds, and the play is going to be unremarkable. Arian Smith raises the ceiling for the wide receiver position for the Jets if he can play well. I think the same is true at the defensive tackle spot. Is Derek Nandi going to play that well? The best thing Derek Nandi has going for him is that he played for the Chiefs, but I mean, he wasn't the reason the Chiefs were winning. And I think sometimes what happens is you get these guys who are kind of incidental to teams winning a championship, guys who are on a championship team, but really had nothing to do with them winning the championship. And we think that they're better than they really are. You look across the defensive tackle spot for the Jets, it's one unremarkable player after unremarkable player. And I think part of the reason we don't really focus on the defensive tackle spot is, for years, the Jets have been doing it with Quincy Williams and his sidekicks. Quincy Williams just has made so many guys look better around him, aside from last year when he had to play next to Javon Kinlaw, and nobody could make Kinlaw look good. But we don't really think about the guys behind Quincy Williams. We don't think about the other defensive tackles playing next to Quincy Williams. I think there's one guy in that group who, again, has a decent shot of becoming a quality starter, and that would be Leonard Taylor, who was one of the stars of preseason a year ago, and a guy who worked his way into the defensive tackle rotation. And for an undrafted rookie to work your way into a defensive tackle rotation and to look like you belong, I mean, I think Leonard Taylor played some pretty solid football for the Jets last year. That's a real positive. Now, for a UDFA like Taylor, even if he's just like a number 4 defensive tackle who, you can play a handful of snaps, that's an excellent outcome for a UDFA. But if he can be more, if he can develop into a quality starting defensive tackle, that's a big deal for the Jets defense, because the guy who plays next to Quincy Williams is going to get a lot of favorable opportunities. Quincy Williams is the guy who draws the attention from the other team's blocking schemes. Essentially, if you've ever followed the way offensive line assignments work, there's 5 offensive linemen versus 4 pass rushers unless you blitz. And the Jets, of course, will blitz a lot. But 5 versus 4 means one guy gets doubled. And usually it's a defensive tackle, because when you're snapping the ball as the center, it's difficult for you to block somebody one-on-one. So usually the center's helping one of the guards on an interior lineman. Most of the time, that center is helping the guard who's blocking Quincy Williams. So you're going to get a lot of one-on-ones. And if Leonard Taylor can show he can develop into a quality starter, it's not something that's essential for Leonard Taylor to be a good player, because if Leonard Taylor's a number 4 defensive tackle who plays a handful of snaps in the rotation, that's an excellent outcome for a UDFA. But if Taylor can become more, I think that's a big deal for the Jets defense, because they'll have plenty of opportunities to produce playing next to Quinn and lots of one-on-one matchups. And then I think to a lesser extent, the safety position's interesting because you got the rookie Malachi Moore, who, I don't think the Jets have confirmed yet that there's like an official position battle at the safety spot, but I thought Moore was an intriguing pick. I think he's a guy who's doesn't blow you away with his physical attributes. But a guy who could end up being a good safety in this league. I think we can presume Andre Sisco has one of the safety spots locked down. The Jets, he got the 3rd biggest free agent contract the Jets gave out to guys they brought in this year from other teams. The only guys who got bigger deals were Justin Fields and Brandon Stevens. Sisco was the 3rd guy. He came in from Jacksonville. He's probably got one of the starting safety spots locked down, but I think Moore versus Tony Adams is an intriguing matchup. And I think Adams a little bit younger. Adams is not old. He's entering year 4, but I'm not sure how much room there is for Tony Adams to grow. And if Malachi Moore, again, shows he can be a starting caliber safety this year, he's a guy who could very easily earn a starting job on this team, and a guy who could make a big contribution on the defensive side of the ball. So ultimately, these 3 positions that I've named, wide receiver, defensive tackle, safety, they have veterans who just have a very low ceiling. Guys who aren't going to give you a super high caliber of play. If the young guys can show that they're good enough, I don't know it really matters what the veterans do in training camp. If the young guys show that they can play, the young guys are going to win the job. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, recently, Justin Fields, in an article on NFL.com, got some MVP buzz. I don't think Justin Fields is going to be an MVP contender this year. In fact, I think it's unfair to even bring up the prospect of him getting an MVP because I think it misses the point. And I think it sets unrealistic expectations on him. More realistic expectations can help him and can help the Jets. I'll explain what I mean as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monarch Money. Have you ever wished managing your money felt easier? Well, with Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. You may not know how many subscriptions you got to streaming services. I'm really bad at that. Monarch Money helps you in so many different areas. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's Monarch Money, MONARCHMONEY.com, code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL. Monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Rugiet. You've probably heard of Viagra or Cialis. Maybe you've even tried them. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet Rugiet Ready. Rugiet Ready is a next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiet's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast, on average in 15 minutes. Effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control when the moment is right. If traditional options have not worked, Rugiet might be the answer. Over 150,000 men have already made the switch. Head to Rugiet.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL to get 15% off today. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing review. Please visit the Rugiet website for full safety information. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue our weekly mailbag. Our next question. John, a recent article on NFL Media suggested that Justin Fields could be in the MVP mix for the Jets in 2025. What are your thoughts? Yes, there was a recent article that suggested that maybe Justin Fields could be an outside contender for the MVP award. I don't think that that's a fair thing to expect out of Justin Fields, because when you talk about the MVP candidates in a given year, you have the usual suspects. You have, the truly top tier quarterbacks who are going to be in the mix every year. Your Mahomeses, your Lamar Jacksons, your Josh Allens, your Joe Burrows. Then you may throw in a guy like Saquon Barkley or Derrick Henry, the great running backs in the league. And usually the MVP either goes to a quarterback or a running back. The other people who enter the mix tend to be quarterbacks on teams that can really support them at a high level. So, you may throw Jalen Hurts into the mix because the Eagles, have such great personnel around him. But the guy we've been comparing Justin Fields to a lot over the last few months is Sam Darnold, because Sam, similarly to Fields, got off to a slow start in his career, kind of bounced around the league a couple times, then finally started delivering last year with the Minnesota Vikings and actually finished 10th in the MVP voting. Now, I would argue the fact that Sam Darnold finished 10th in the MVP voting shows that a lot of the voters are still pretty unsophisticated, because I think Minnesota's infrastructure helped Sam more than Sam helped them. I think Sam gave them good quarterback play. I think Sam gave them what they needed. And I think a lot of quarterbacks that could not have given Minnesota what Sam Darnold did last year. But I don't think Sam Darnold was the 10th most valuable player in the league. I don't think Sam Darnold was the most valuable player on his team. I don't think Sam Darnold was close to being the most valuable player on his team. I think that Sam Darnold was the type of quarterback that in a great situation could do enough to help his team win. And I don't think Justin Fields is going to be in the same situation for the Jets. Sam Darnold was thrown to one of the top 3 receivers in the sports in Justin Jefferson. He had Addison, who was a good number 2 receiver. He had Hawkinson, who was a quality receiving tight end. Fields is in a situation where he's going to throw to Garrett Wilson, who's a very good receiver, but probably somewhere between 10 and 20 when we rank receivers in the league, which is, when you consider the receiver talent in this league right now, between 10 and 20 is excellent. Nothing against Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson's a phenomenal player, but not on Justin Jefferson's level. Jets don't really have a number 2 receiver. Their tight end's going to be a rookie, Mason Taylor, who very well might be a good player in the future. Might even be a good player this year. But I don't want to count too much on a rookie. I don't want to count on a rookie being a good tight end right out of the gate. So I don't think the infrastructure is in place for Fields to have big success. And I think if we're being honest, Fields is not the type of quarterback the Jets should be looking at as their long-term solution. We've talked about this a lot in the show, and I think it's worth reiterating. Fields is the guy who you hope is your bridge quarterback. He's your guy you hope is good enough that he stabilizes your quarterback position for a couple of years. That he gives you solid enough play that you don't enter the NFL draft in 2026 feeling like you're desperate for a quarterback, that we have to draft a quarterback. You hope he's good enough that you enter the draft. If there's a guy you love, you pick him, and then he can sit for a year because Fields can still play next year. And if there's nobody good enough, well, you feel comfortable. We got Fields. He's good. Fields is a solid bridge guy. He can get us through a couple more seasons. That's what you're looking for from Justin Fields. I don't think it's fair to ask a guy who's already bounced through 2 teams in his first 4 seasons, now on team number 3, that he's going to suddenly turn into an MVP candidate overnight, especially in a situation like this, again, where I think the Jets' talent is underrated. I think that a lot of people are selling the Jets short when they say that, the Jets are going to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. But I also am realistic from the standpoint that this is not an elite roster. It's not the type of roster that can turn a quarterback like Justin Fields, who is trying to revive his career, into an MVP candidate. I think that's a lot to ask. I think it's a lot to expect. I don't think that Justin Fields is going to be the MVP mix this year. That's it. I just don't think the pieces are in place for that to conceivably happen. On another team, I would be hard pressed to believe Justin Fields was going to be an MVP candidate. I'm saying this as someone who's like kind of positive on Fields, but you have to be reasonable with your expectations. And part of my problem with like throwing Justin Fields in the MVP mix is that it's almost saying like if Justin Fields isn't an MVP candidate this year, it's a failure, and that's not the case at all. Justin Fields doesn't need to be an MVP candidate to be a successful quarterback for the Jets. He needs to play at an acceptable level. He needs to play well enough that the Jets don't feel like they're heading into the draft next year desperate for a starting quarterback. Next question, John. Outside of Fields, who do you think is the most important player for the Jets in 2025? So this might be cheating, but I think there are 2 answers to this, and they play the same position. They're the 2 tackles, the bookend guys, Olu Fashanu and Armand Membu. Because if these guys play well this year, the Jets offense will be functional. Jets do not have a lot of talent at the skill positions. They have Garrett Wilson. They have Breece Hall. We're going to talk about Breece in a little bit. Maybe they have another good back or 2 behind Breece, but wide receiver, very shaky after Garrett. Tight end, we got a rookie. You never know what a rookie's going to do. Mason Taylor could be a really good player and still have some growing pains this year. After Taylor, we got nothing at tight end. But if you can control the point of attack in the NFL, your offense has a shot. And the Jets have 2 guys who are youngsters, guys who don't really have track records. Fashion, who played a few games last year, and he played well towards the end of the season before he got injured. Membu is a rookie. You never know what you're getting out of guys who aren't experienced. But they're both players really with top 10 pedigrees. I know Fashion was technically the 11th pick, but that's because the Jets traded down 1 spot in 2024. If the Jets had just stayed at 10, they would have taken Fashanu. So he, for all intents and purposes, is a top 10 pick. And Membu was a top 10 pick this year. So these are guys with big talent. They're good. They have enough potential to be drafted in the top 10. So this isn't like this isn't like the wide receiver position where we're hoping like a 4th round pick in Arian Smith pans out, and we're hoping maybe a 3rd round pick in Malachi Corley, or a UDFA and Xavier Gibson beats the odds. We're talking 2 guys with legitimate top 10 pick talents, guys with very high end upside. And if they both play well, again, the Jets are going to control the point of attack. And when you can control the trenches, even if you don't have great skill players, your offense can function. And there's enough talent on this team on the defensive side of the ball for it to be an above average unit. The talent may not be quite what it was 2 years ago, but it's still pretty high on the defensive side of the ball. And this defense can win games if they get functional enough offense. And I think the road to a functional offense runs through the 2 tackles. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk Breece Hall. I think that there are certain benchmarks he's going to have to hit in 2025 to return in 2026 with a new contract. Let's talk about that as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. Fantasy football is back. Fire up the group chat, get your draft board ready, and buckle up for a season filled with breakouts, busts, and all the overreactions we live for. It's all going down on Yahoo Fantasy. This year, me and Locked On Jets are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. I've used Yahoo Fantasy for years, and I love how smooth the draft day experience is. And to celebrate 28 years of fantasy greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days, giving you more ways to play, more ways to draft, and more ways to win. And it all begins on August 4th. Stay tuned and get started by creating or joining a Yahoo Fantasy Football League at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. That's yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. And let's make this fantasy season the best one yet. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question, John, let's play a game. Extend one, franchise one, let one walk. Quincy Williams, Alijah Vera-Tucker, Breece Hall. So this is a tricky one because Breece Hall is really the only guy you can franchise. And that's because the way the franchise tag is determined is kind of dumb. So they include all linebackers, whether you're like an off-ball linebacker or whether you're like an edge rusher who stands up and is technically a linebacker. So that means like if you franchise a linebacker, he gets paid like one of the top edge rushers in the league. And the same is true on the offensive line. The offensive line is considered one position. So if you franchise a guard like AVT, you have to pay him as though he's a franchise left tackle because they take the top 5 salaries of all offensive linemen, which are the top 5 salaries are left tackle. So you have to essentially pay a guard like he's a left tackle. So Breece Hall is the only one you could transfer. Breece would not be my priority. I mean, if we were talking about which players I would prioritize in the order I'd prioritize them, AVT would be number one because he plays the offensive line. He plays the most important position of the three. He's a really solid player. And he's also young. He's in his mid-20s. So AVT would be the guy I'd re-sign. I guess if I have to play this game, if I can only re-sign one, I can only franchise one, and I have to let one go, Quincy Williams would be the one I'd let go. Because, again, Breece is the only one you can franchise. Because if I franchise Quincy, I have to pay him like he's an edge rusher because of the way the franchise tag works. If I franchise AVT, I have to pay him like he's a left tackle because of the way the franchise tag works. Franchise tag essentially gives you a 1-year contract worth the average of the top 5 salaries at your position. But for AVT's case, his position's offensive line. So he's lumped in with the left tackles who get paid huge money. Quincy Williams is a linebacker, but they include all linebackers, including pass rushing linebackers. So under this exercise, that's the way I have to do it. If I was ordering how I would prioritize them, AVT would be 1, Quincy would be 2, Breece would be 3. And the reason for that is Quincy has, I think Quincy's going to age well, even though he's close to 30. Normally I'm against extending players who are about to turn 30, but I just think his game at the linebacker position, the way he's grown the last couple of years, his game's going to age well. I think that, he's not going to have a steep fall off. I think he's a guy who's going to play well into his 30s at a high level. But I think if the game is that you have to franchise one, Breece is the one you have to franchise. On that note, our next question, John, Breece Hall did not get an extension yet, like Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson, players who were drafted in 2022, and his contract's about to expire this year. What would it take for you to feel comfortable extending Breece on a big contract? Well, of course, it always comes down to price. But if we're talking about a big contract, Breece has to get back to the guy he was in 2022. I mean, during that early stretch in the 2022 season before he suffered the knee injury in Denver, he looked like he was on his way to being one of the top backs in the league. I mean, he was a guy who he wasn't just the best player for the Jets on offense early in 2022. He was like the offense. He was the go-to guy. The Jets, you have to remember, this was a point where Zach Wilson was not playing at a high level, but the Jets were still winning games. And it's because all they had to do was hand the ball to number 20, and it was a big play waiting to happen. Over the last 2 years, Breece has not been as effective. In 2023, he was a big play threat, but he was not consistent on a play-to-play basis. His success rate was low. Success rate is the percentage of plays which ended success for the offense. 2024, his success rate was higher, but he barely hit any home runs. There weren't many splash plays from Breece last year. So why is that? And we're going to find out I think we're going to find out the answer to that in 2025, because I do think it's theoretically possible that the guy we saw in 2022 is the real Breece Hall. It's possible that in 2023, he still showed his ability as a big play threat. It was just hidden because on a play-to-play basis, his offensive line wasn't run blocking well enough. So when they blocked well, he was able to hit the home runs, but they didn't block well enough for him to be a consistent back. Then last year, the offensive line was a little bit better, but he was dealing with a knee injury. So maybe when the offensive line was better, he was consistent on a play-to-play basis, but because of the knee injury, he didn't have that fifth gear to really, break off those 20, 30-yard runs. But what I'll also say is that the excuse time is over now for Breece. I feel like I've been making excuses for him for a long time. I feel like a lot of people have been making excuses for him for a long time. Now it's time for Breece to produce. If in 2023, the reason he wasn't consistent play-to-play was the offensive line, well, hopefully the offensive line's better this year. If the reason in 2024 he wasn't hitting home runs was the knee injury, well, the knee should be better this year. So now it's time for Breece to go out there and show that he's a top-end back. I would not feel comfortable paying him a huge contract right now. I'd feel comfortable extending him on a moderate contract. I'd have no issue with that. And he's going to have every opportunity to produce because, again, at the skill positions, it's Garrett Wilson and very little else. Breece is going to see a lot of targets in the passing game. I mean, I think we could see 2023 type production where, he was one of the more productive backs statistically in the receiving area. And, the checkdowns are going to be a big part of the offense. You would think the Jets are going to get into the screen game a lot this year. I mean, one thing we're going to talk about in the days and weeks ahead with Tanner Engstrand is Engstrand's going to have to run a different sort of offense than Detroit ran. Engstrand comes from Detroit. He was the passing game coordinator. But the Detroit style offense is not going to work in New York. There are certain ways he's going to have to adjust to the personnel he has. And one of them, I think, is he's going to have to embrace the screen game. The Lions did not throw a lot of screens last year. And with the lack of receiver talent the Jets have, and with Breece Hall's ability to make big plays in the screen game, Breece is a guy who can secure the catch. I don't know how great of a route runner he is. He's not a guy who's going to destroy people running routes from the slot the way maybe Christian McCaffrey or Alvin Kamara will. But Breece is a big play threat as a receiver. His success as a receiver in 2023 wasn't really about route running. I mean, I'm sure you could find like a clip of him running a really good route. I'm sure he's capable of running a really good route or two here or there. But his success in 2023 was just more an extension of his ability as a big play guy. Once he gets the ball in his hands, he's a big threat. And the Jets need to figure out ways to get him the ball in space. They need to be creative in how they get him the ball, and they need to utilize him a lot in the screen game. If they can, if Breece has that sort of big season, then I'd have no issue paying him. And the Jets do have the franchise tag at their disposal if things get dicey. But I'll say this, Breece has not been consistent enough. I think one of Breece's issues, he's too hesitant hitting holes. And that's something that's hurt him. Breece is a big back, but he doesn't always run with power. I think when you hesitate, even if you're a big guy, you become sort of easy to bring down. Another thing I think Tanner Engstrand is going to have to do is get Breece on more gap style runs. A gap style run is more of a downhill type play where the running back gets ahead of steam and moves forward. And, you read the blocks in front of you, and if you need to adjust, you do it on instinct. I think Breece with Breece, the Jets have maybe been running a few too many zone style runs, which are more you kind of dance, you kind of scan your blocking and then pick your hole. You have to pick it at the right time. I don't think Breece is good at that. I think you want to get him ahead of steam because once Breece Hall gets downhill, he's tougher to bring down. He's a big back. So lots of the Jets have to do to maximize Breece. But at the end of the day, we want to see Breece Hall look like the star he was in 2022. We saw Breece Hall look like a star at times in 2023 and even 2024, but not consistently. So can Breece Hall be a star? That's the question. And for me, that tells me whether or not he should be brought back on a big contract. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.